Hey guys, how's it going today? Listen, I'm gonna take a minute and do a little bio on my 32 Ford. Now, I know a lot of times on TV, this car actually was built on TV, and you don't get all the details on TV that we do to these cars when we're building them, because we could film for 100 hours and you're gonna get 43 minutes of it. And so you don't get to see everything. So I'm gonna just take a minute, go through this car and let you guys know about my 32 Ford. Now, 1932 was a very interesting time because you were at the peak of the Great Depression. You know, Henry Ford had a ton of money when he was building this car. So it was a time when Henry Ford actually developed his V8 engine, which was an affordable motor back then. He built those motors for production, but 1932 was the first V8 that Ford put in one of his vehicles that was in a production line that actually could really go out and be affordable to buy. Now, 32, they didn't sell a lot of cars because of the Depression. There wasn't a lot of people buying them. They were taking their cars from the 20s and the 30s and putting truck beds in them and doing all kinds of stuff to upgrade their old car so they could keep driving it. The cool thing about the 1932 is it's a 1 year only car, so there's no parts that are interchangeable. So you can't take a 33 or a 31 and any of those parts are going to interchange with a 32. It's 1 year only. So the car actually is very rare. It's a very desirable. If you have a steel body Henry Ford car, you're very lucky, because they're getting very rare to find and very hard. But anyway, let me walk you through this car and show you a few things on it. Okay, so in 1945, when the war was over, you got to think a lot of these guys were getting out of the war. They were like, okay, what are we going to do? Let's start building some cool cars. Well, in 1932, before they went to the war, these were the cars that their mom and dad were buying brand new off the showroom floor. So by, I would say, the 1950s, they were taking these cars, they were doing some really cool stuff with them. You know, they were putting big flat heads in them. They were putting superchargers on them. They were the ones that were actually inventing and creating the performance parts that we know today. You know, like these flatheads that are in here, they were building, lots of different companies started building performance heads, carburetors, intake manifolds, and they were trying to make these cars go faster. I think they were actually the forefathers for the performance industry that we know today. Like, a lot of people get on the computer, they just order a part and it shows up. Well, back then, these guys were actually building these parts in their machine shop and selling them to the public, just to the race industry. A lot of them guys were trying to set land speed records back then, and this was in the mix of it. This year right here, this is the car they used. This was it. And so it's really kind of a cool piece of history in the performance world to actually have a 32 Ford, because they were doing so much with them back then. But I'm going to get into the motor a little bit, but before we do that, I want to talk about the front end of the car. The headlights on this thing are 1932 Ford truck headlights. These came on the bigger trucks. They didn't come on this car, but I really actually love the big headlights. It fits the era, but they're just bigger, they look better. I really like them. The cross member for the headlights here, I know that I was saying that we can't interchange parts from the 20s, but this actually came off a 3031 Model A, and I just cut it down and welded it and made it fit on the front. This V8 emblem right here, these are the old mechanical brake rods that were in this. So these cars used to stop mechanically on a push-pull system, basically. And so, as you can see, I stepped it up to juice brakes. This is probably a mid-40s setup right here that we had laying around the shop that I incorporated into this, so we had juice brakes on it so it would stop. Let's open the hood here. We'll take a gander at the motor. Okay, now there's about 2 or 3 things on here that are not period correct for this year. So when we built this car, we wanted to keep it from, I would say, no more than 1950. We didn't want to exceed 1950. It was 1950 and down. Because you got to figure, the guys that were getting out of the war in World War II, by 46, 47, they were, you know, they were busy, man. They were wanting to do stuff. They were, you know, the skilled guys that got out of the war. So we wanted to build it like they would have built it back then. And, you know, as you can see in here, we have this is a 49 Merc motor that's in it. It's 255 cubic inches. It probably makes right around 100 horsepower. You know, you can see that these come with a dual water pump system. So there's a water pump pulley here and one over there. This is a flathead design. And the reason why they call this a flathead design is because of the cylinder head you can see is actually flat, but the valves are in the block. They're not inside the cylinder head like a lot of times they're inside the cylinder head. These are actually in the block. So that's why they call it a flathead. So they ride the valves ride right alongside of the piston. It's kind of a neat design. They actually rev pretty good and make pretty decent horsepower for what they are. You know, this one here's got an Offenhauser intake manifold and 2 Stromberg carburetors on it. So it does run good. It's snappy. You know, surprisingly, it runs a little bit better than you would think. I mean, for something that is that old. I can see why these guys loved these flatheads back then, because they do make, they rev. They actually make some RPM and they run pretty good. The cool thing about what we did is we found the generator off a 47 Diamond T truck that I had laying around the shop. Now, I know on TV we don't get to show you a lot of the details that go into these, but this is a generator off a truck from 1947. That would have been something these guys would have been doing back in 1947. I mean, if there was a wrecked truck in the junkyard and they needed an alternator or generator, this is what they would have done. So we put this 47 Diamond T generator on here, which actually works beautifully for a 12 volt system, because we have it running on a 12 volt system. The steering in this whole operation basically is out of the 47 Diamond T. So the drag link actually came out of the 47 Diamond T. All of this came out of the 47 Diamond T and the steering box. So it's actually out of a 2.5 ton truck. It makes it really nice to steer this thing. The way that it's set up, here reduced into the steering, as you can see underneath the dash, you can kind of see the steering box right there, how it's set up in there, how we mounted it. And it actually works really well. It's a great little steering setup. Okay, so as you can see inside this car, we have a 1944 dash in it, which is the most notorious car. It's probably, aside of the 32 Ford, the 1940 Ford is probably almost as popular. There was not very many of them made because of the war. They were kind of the beginning of the roundy round car in that era. By 1940, these guys were running moonshine during the week, and then they were running their cars on the racetrack during the week. So they were pretty serious about their cars, and 1940 was right around that time. And they're very classy dash. I wanted to put it in this car because it goes really good with this 32, and it just gives it a little style. Okay, let's talk about the chop on this 1932. Now, the 32, 33, and 34 look super awesome when you chop them. I mean, they look good either way. If it's a full fendered car, they look good just stock. Anytime you take the fenders off them, I'm thinking, dude, we got to chop this thing. It makes them look good. We've probably got a 5.5 inch chop in this car. The cool thing about the chop on this that makes it very special is that my dear friend Gene Winfield, he is going to be 92 years old this year. He chopped this car with me when he was 90. He came to WelderUp. We chopped it on TV, 90 years old. I asked Gene, I said, hey, when was the first time you ever chopped a car? And he goes, ironically, I chopped a 1932 Ford when I was 13 years old. So this guy's been chopping cars seriously for 75, 80 years. You know what I mean? It's pretty cool to have a guy come in the shop that's been doing this so long and do this with me. It makes the car special to me that his hands touched this car and helped me with the chop on it. It was really cool. When he was torch welding all this together, and what I mean by torch welding is you use a torch and tie wire, and you weld all this together with a torch and tie wire, and then you hammer weld it, which you take a little dolly on the backside and you hit it with a hammer, and you kind of flatten the welds out, and it starts looking good. Now, I wanted it to be kind of crude. I wanted this thing to look like we chopped it in the 50s. You know what I mean? You know, back in the 50s, they didn't really have MIG welders. They didn't have TIG welders, okay? They had a torch and tie wire, and that's how they would have done it back then. And you can see all this is just brazing where patches and pieces of this 32 have been put back together because, like I said, this car spent a lot of its time upside down in a ditch somewhere. So, you know, all this has kind of been repaired. But as you can see, it really gives it a sleek look. You know, there's been a little bit of pie cutting here to get this to line up. Sometimes you have to cut and pull this a little bit and get this to line up right here. There is a little bit of work, you know, pie cutting it here to kind of shrink it down to get it in to fit the car. Now, what they typically would have done back in the old days is they would have taken lead and leaded this all in right here, and made it smooth, okay? And a lot of the old guys like Gene Winfield is a lead slinging son of a gun. I mean, this guy can put some lead down and make a car look slick. And when they're done with them, they look like a brand new car. But I wanted mine to kind of look old. I wanted it to give it an old look, and I didn't want it to look like it's been, you know, tons of time of body work invested in this car. I wanted that crude look, like these guys threw this car together in 1950 and they went and raced it. And that's what the look is. The top of this car right here, believe it or not, is a 1965 Ford Mustang lid. So this was cut out of a wrecked Mustang, and then we louvered the heck out of it and welded it in here. It kind of has the same shape as the roof of a 32, so it turned out really good. The louvers are just for ventilation. Driving across the desert out here, it just flows the air. It cools the engine down. And it's a cool look. Basically, more than anything, it just looks freaking cool. You know, that's what I love about it. You know, you can see back here we have just regular old military tires on it. I think the military tires really give it a look of World War II, and something that the guys would have put on back then for traction, if they were out racing on the salt flats, or if they were out on the beach somewhere. A lot of these guys go race these on the beach even today. As you can see, the trunk actually works. Got a set of jumper cables in there just in case, and an extra gallon of water because it does puke a little water once in a while. So as you can see in my door panel, I carry some Marlboro mystery oil. I mean, these cars run good on it. You can put it in the crankcase, you can put it in your gas. They say the Marlboro mystery oil is what actually won the war. So, and I believe it. My grandpa used that stuff religiously, and it's just really cool stuff. And as you can see in here, I have a seat out of like a 31 two-door sedan car, and I used it for my front seat right here, and it worked out really good. It's old, it's raggedy, but it looks good in there. And just reupholstered the seat. Wanted to give it that old vintage look in here, something that they would have done probably back in, you know, the 1940s or 50s. Okay, so we're gonna run this thing over to the lift. I wanna put it on the lift, get it in the air to show you guys the underneath of this thing. It's pretty simple, but it's kind of cool. So let's take it over to the lift and get it in the air so you guys can see what's underneath it. So what we got here is basically an old school drop axle. Now, whoever built this axle back probably in the 40s did a hell of a good job. This is what you call a heat and beat job. So what they did is they heated this and beat it around, and they made this drop axle. So this drop axle probably is out of a 1930 or 31 Ford, and what they would do is heat them up and bend them, and they would make a drop axle, which would lower the front of the car to give it kind of a cool hot rod look. The way that these wishbones are set up in the front is really cool. First of all, what I'd like to explain is this particular piece of iron right here is very unique because there is one weld seam down the middle. It goes from round over here to oval down here. Now that's a Henry Ford design that most people still to this day don't know how to come up with this idea. It's really cool how this was made. But this is actually a really awesome suspension setup. As you can see how this works under here, if I move the front end, you can see how here's your center point right here, your springs out here, right? And then these are basically your trailing arms here, and you can see how this thing actually off-road would do really well. It's really kind of a neat, simple suspension setup. It's got the old juice brakes, meaning the juice means that it runs on a hydraulic oil that basically stops the brakes and makes it more, it just makes it more efficient. It's quicker, more dependable. The mechanical brakes, you always had to adjust them. There was always a problem with them. So this makes it a lot better. We come back through here, we got a 3-speed transmission. We've got Zephyr gears in it, and they're cut. So when we had this apart, Merlin went inside this transmission and cut the gears in it. So when you shift it, see, a lot of these transmissions didn't come with synchros, meaning that when you push the clutch in, you can't just go to another gear. You gotta double clutch them a lot of times. Well, this one here with the cut gears in it, you could just basically shift through the gears, and it turned it into a hot rod transmission. Let's see what else we got under here. If we move on back to the back here, which is pretty cool, we've got a 1938 Ford rear end out of a truck. So we had this laying in our junkyard in the back. It's a banjo style rear end, meaning this is the banjo style because it looks like a banjo, kinda. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's got the rear unispring in the rear, and it's pretty much set up kind of like the front. So these things actually articulate pretty well going through, you know, ravines. They were set up to be off-road basically back then because they didn't have asphalted roads very much. But this was actually the torque tube out of the 38 Ford, and as you can see right here, we had to cut it right here and shorten it because in a truck it's a little bit longer. We had to shorten this down and couple the drive shaft inside of there, because inside of here is a drive shaft about that big around, and we basically sleeved it, welded it together, and we made our own, we lengthened it to what we needed for our own drive line. So I just wanted to kind of get you guys underneath this and see what happened. And you know, like I said, on TV you don't get to see all the details. You know, what I'm doing here with these small episodes of detail for these cars is to show you guys the ins and outs of everything that we pretty much did to this car. I could probably go on and on and on and on for days. There's so many details and so much little tiny stuff that you would probably get bored and then click off this shit and not watch it no more. So I don't want to get that crazy. But I did run you through a bunch of the details and a lot of things about the car, why I built the car, why I love this car. Look, at the end of the day, this is a classic. When I drive this thing down the road, people they almost get in car wrecks looking at it because they don't even know where it came from. They think this is from another planet. This is an old classic car that is a part of our American history. It's been through a lot of things. I mean, it's seen a lot of stuff in its life. I mean, this car is what, 85 years old, so it's pretty special to me. So it's one of my cars that I can get in the shop, hit the key, fire it up, and go drive it around. It smokes a little bit, makes a lot of noise, the transmission's growling, the little flathead's popping and making all kinds of racket, but that's what makes it so cool. inspiration for this car was my grandpa, Keith Crabb. He was a gunner's mate on a destroyer ship from 1942 to 1945. Now, I heard all kinds of horrible stories of World War II and what happened. My grandpa really didn't talk about it a whole lot, but the stories that I did get out of him, I was just completely blown away by what those guys had to see compared to what we have to see in today's day and age. Back then, you know, you went out on that destroyer ship, or you went out in the field and you were gone for 3 years. You didn't get to, you know, send selfies to your girlfriend. You didn't get to send pictures. You didn't get to text. There was none of that. It was like, see you later. I hope you make it back alive. And if you don't, you know, thank you for fighting for our country, basically. So I named the car Gunner's Mate. My grandfather sat on a destroyer ship and watched horrible things that you can't even imagine happen through a you know, a scope. Like, he was watching where everything was landing, the bullets were landing. And when they were bombing Hiroshima back during the war, my grandpa was horribly terrified with the fact that his Marine soldiers were getting blown up on that island, and he could see it and he knew it, and there was nothing he could do about it. He died, the day he died, he was talking about it. I remember because I was there. The day he died, he was telling me about what happened. So I called this car the Gunner's Mate. I don't think a lot of people know what a Gunner's Mate was, but basically they were aiming these guns to where they were going. They were loading the shells in the big guns. He said that the shells were just this big around and that long, and they put in there, close the door, boom, and then pull the shell out, throw another one in. I mean, they were just firing as fast as they could go. It was all manual back then. You know, there was a story of my grandpa's brother and my grandpa both went to war at the same time, World War II. They were out in the South Pacific, both of them one was on a carrier and one was on a destroyer. And I know after Pearl Harbor got bombed, they thought each other might have got in that bomb, you know, they got blew up at Pearl Harbor. But they were both luckily out at ocean. They called ahead. My grandpa knew what battleship that my uncle was on. And he called up there and he said, hey, is there any way that I can see him? You know, I mean, I just want to talk to my brother. And he goes, well, as a matter of fact, our ship's pulling out of Pearl Harbor now. As they were pulling in, they both ran out on the bow of the ship and waved at each other as they went by. It's a pretty cool story. I mean, to think two brothers that are probably, you know, only, you know, a year and a half apart get to see each other and wave as they go by. It was a pretty cool story. But I just want to let everyone know this car to me is meaningful because of that, and the history and the great country that we live in is because of those guys. So that was my inspiration for the Gunner's Mate.